Sure. Great. Well, it's good to be with you all virtually. I really look forward to your questions. I've been thinking about this for quite a while, maybe in some sense approaching 20 years, I guess, since I really, I guess, had a conversion experience as a teenager and started thinking about science and faith fairly soon after that, approximately almost 20 years ago now. Um, I studied biology and philosophy at university and as an undergraduate, and I did my PhD in experimental evolution. And I guess as a student, I started thinking in detail about what does it mean to where does evolution fit with Christian faith? And I guess most Christians who study biology start to think about that to some extent. And because I started postgraduate studies in this area, I really, I guess, started to specialize in it. So these are the thoughts I've come up with over the last 10 or so years since I've been a researcher in this area. And yeah, I look forward to the questions that I'm sure you'll have once I've gone through it. So I'm a research fellow based in Cambridge. I work at an institute here, and I work on evolutionary genetics, particularly recently very deep time evolution, so evolution over billions of years. Okay, so these are the topics that I'll be going through: historical sciences in God's action, some thoughts around that, a brief history of um, some interesting developments in history, thinking about deep time, a brief summary of what I take to be the genetic evidence for common ancestry, or some of that, some thoughts on protein evolution, which is my recent work, and then summarizing some areas in which I think it's possible to make good evolutionary design arguments. So what about historical processes and God's actions? I think this is important context, or this is the most helpful framework that I found for thinking about evolution in general and from a Christian perspective. So one, I guess, important kind of analogy is the way that God has acted in history as revealed in the Bible. So I think the history of the people of God in the Old Testament or in the Hebrew Bible is very messy, and it's often not clear how God is acting. Um, but so history is often messy, but God is still involved in that, and often the involvement of God is only evident kind of well after the fact. And I think this is an interesting analogy for historical processes in Earth history, including the development of life. So I think it's an interesting thing to think through. To what extent are these things analogous? Is God's involvement in history of people, particularly his people in the Old Testament and the New Testament, is that analogous to his involvement with the history of the earth and the history of life? I think there are some analogies, including the initial apparent messiness of that history, but then I think you can often trace threads through that history that they end up being important. Another interesting analogy to the evolution of biology, which is a bit closer, is the evolution of languages. So this is not controversial, whatever you think about evolution, that there has at least been a lot of evolution of language families. So various languages have diverged from an inferred Proto-Indo-European approximately 4,000 years ago. And this ancestry wasn't really discovered until the late 1700s, and people really studied these different languages and realized they even though they're superficially very different, there are actually some very deep similarities that explained well by having common ancestry. So this is just a table of the numbers in various different languages, which have a lot of similarities, and that's inferred to be because they have a common ancestry, even things which are superficially as vastly different as Sanskrit and English. And from this kind of data, you can build an evolutionary tree where you have English is kind of part of a group of Western, I guess, kind of Germanic languages. My wife is Dutch. We both used to live in Germany. Obviously, these languages are somewhat similar, but it's also related to the northern languages such as Danish. So this is not really controversial, but once you accept this, I think you accept the basic kind of principles of evolutionary inference, and these same principles, I would say, can be applied to biology as well. Um, so there's other things that have historical processes in the world, not just languages, not just peoples, um, not just life, which we'll come to, but also the physical universe, such as stars. And the evolution of stars is understood very well. So my wife is an astrophysicist and studies this kind of thing and plotted this diagram for me, which is a kind of famous diagram, the field, the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, showing the different kinds of stars, and there are kind of evolutionary trajectories within this diagram, and we understand the states that stars move between over very long periods of time very well, because we have many observations of different categories of stars and can make these inferences. So this is well understood for stars. What about more broadly? So I already said that processes occurring within human history are often very messy, but Christian belief is that God foreknew and in some sense ordained at least some of these. And of course, Christians disagree on the exact model of this, but the idea that God foreknew all of that is not that controversial. Some follow discoverable laws or tendencies, and we can study these in a scientific way. Studying these processes is not atheistic. I just really want to emphasize that. And that's, I think, an interesting point here is that this is not controversial in the case of the evolution of languages, at least the small-scale evolution of languages. It's not controversial in the case of the evolution of stars for most Christians, but it becomes controversial in the evolution of life. And it's interesting to think through why that might be. So the same things which are true about human history, some of these things are also true about the history of the physical world. It's studied in geology, the history of the Earth, studied in planetary science, the history of the solar system and galaxies is studied in astronomy, history of the universe is studied in cosmology. So God made all of these, but we can study the historical processes. And of course, the claim of the Christian who believes in evolution is that the same could also be true for species. The origin of species, the big question of evolutionary biology. So this was people were starting to think through this kind of thing in the early 1800s. One of them was William Whewell, master of Trinity College in Cambridge, and a major influence on Charles Darwin. Whewell, who was a philosopher, theologian, and a polymath in various ways, he did work in various other areas, said, with regard to the material world, we can at least go so far as this. We can perceive that events are brought about not by insulated interpositions of divine power, so kind of interventions where God is inserting his power just at very specific times in history, exerted in each particular case, but by the establishment of general laws. So I think in that context, he was writing about astronomy, but people were starting to explore this more broadly, and of course in geology. And the question was being raised, could this apply to the evolution of life itself? And Charles Darwin actually uses this as the first quote on the opening page of The Origin of Species. And I think it's interesting that he uses this quote, but I think Darwin is trying to frame his project as potentially fitting within this project they have been developing over the last few decades of seeing God as using laws in the creation of the universe and its development, but also potentially the creation of life. So that's the framework that Darwin was, at least initially, I think, seeing himself as fitting within. Okay, what about this idea of deep time? Where did this come from? How is this developed? So deep time is the study of history over billions of years, both potentially the history of life and the history of the universe itself. This idea that the universe is very old actually has much older historical precedent than a lot of people are aware of. So Robert Hooke, a famous microbiologist and microscopist, said 171 years before The Origin was published. He notes various things that I think are interesting. That there have been many other species of creatures in former ages. So he realizes that there's some history of change over time and even an extinction of species, which was beginning to be controversial around this time. He says not only are there things that have gone extinct, but there's some things that are new that didn't used to be. He's probably just talking about varieties within a species, but people are starting to realize that there is real development within biology. This is based on fossils in particular, and he says fossils, in all probability, will far antedate, in other words, precede all the most ancient monuments of the world. He's thinking particularly about the pyramids, which are the oldest monuments known at the time, and will afford more information in natural history than those others put together will in civil. So in other words, we can learn so much about natural history from fossils in the same kind of way that we can learn about human history from archaeology. But of course, he says it must be granted that it's very difficult to read them, to kind of piece together some story out of these fossils and to raise a chronology out of them. So how to put these in order, how to work out kind of historical processes from these artifacts, these fossils that we find. But of course, this was seen that we can do this in human history, and people were starting to explore this for the history of life, well before the Origin of Species was written. So I think this is important because a lot of biology textbooks or kind of first year biology lectures will present it as if there was kind of the sharp transition from young Earth creationism through to evolution. But actually, there was a lot of time in between where people were realizing that the Earth is very old and starting to think theologically, how do we fit this in with what the Bible says? I think another interesting angle is that it wasn't just science that was influencing what people were thinking about deep time. And this very, very distinguished historian of geology, Martin Rudwick, has written about this. And he says that it's a strong sense of history, which gave the Judeo-Christian tradition an underlying structure that's closely analogous to the modern view of the Earth's deep history as something finite and directional. So he argues in this historical work that actually the Judeo-Christian idea that time is linear was really important in the historical development of people realizing that there is a deep time history to Earth as well. This was not as trivial as it might seem, because probably most cultures have believed in either a cyclical universe or some other kind of eternal universe, such as a static universe. And often, at least in my experience, in kind of first year biology lectures or biology textbooks or this kind of thing, or popular science works, people conflate deep time with an eternal universe, but they're actually very different, particularly if there are directional processes over deep time. A universe which starts and is going somewhere and has an end is a very different kind of universe to one which has just always existed or which kind of repeats in cycles. So there's various worldviews which are cyclical, of course, that universe eventually comes back to the beginning and goes around and around again. There's worldviews where everything is basically static, where any change is kind of superficial. Or there's chaotic. There's this picture of the world where everything is kind of chaotic. There might be little bubbles of order or apparent directionality, but those all fit within a broader kind of ultimate chaos. And then there's what I would say is the Judeo-Christian perspective, that time has a beginning, it will have an end, and it does have some directionality within it. It is linear. So this recognition of deep time, of geological strata, layers, and progression in Earth history led to questions about why organisms in successive periods of time, epochs, resembled each other. So why is it that we can trace back in time, and when we seem to do that, we find organisms which are sometimes somewhat similar to what we see today, but not quite the same, that there's resemblance, and then you go back further and something that resembled the one that we saw from the previous time period that's even older, that somewhat resembles the intermediate time period, etc., that there's resemblance and some continuity. So all of these thoughts were challenging the idea of species fixity, even for Linnaeus, the kind of classic foundation of modern taxonomy. Even he was thinking that that species aren't actually fixed, I believe, in the later editions of his work. So the observed complex history of species where there's some level of diversity and some level of non-fixity led to exploration of what forces were driving this this variation within species, and then potentially even variations between species. Increasingly, it was realized that law-like approaches were extremely successful in areas like astronomy and geology. And could they be successful in biology is the question. Okay, so this was the kind of historical background for evolution. Um, Now I want to jump to the evidence that I see as a geneticist for evolution and just a couple of aspects. I'm very happy to follow up with questions on this. Maybe a trivial point I think is I've only realized recently how important this is that DNA is really important in thinking about evolution. And that's because DNA is the primary physical basis of inheritance. It is the molecule of inheritance. So if evolution is true, then it would make sense that we'd see evidence for it in DNA. A lot of skeptics of evolution sometimes will kind of minimize the importance of any patterns we find in DNA. But the patterns in DNA are really important because DNA is the molecule of inheritance. Because we observe that DNA is inherited. So when we see similar patterns in DNA, we naturally make the inference that these similar patterns derive from a common ancestor. We trust this for paternity tests and broader evidence of relatedness, such as the company 23andMe, which will sequence at least part of your genome, and that will help you work out who you might be related to in terms of broad people groups, but also potentially other relatives. So one aspect of the evidence from DNA is that there are these core genes that are found across life, such as ATP synthase, where you see basically the same structure in eukaryotes, in bacteria, and in archaea, the three main branches of life. There's maybe a couple of hundred of these genes that are more or less universally conserved across life, but with differences which follow a nested hierarchy pattern. I think one nice example for thinking about evolution is thinking about rodents. Just that there's a lot of these animals, and they cluster into these nested hierarchies, and we have genetic evidence and fossil evidence for this in extreme detail. And I think it's maybe good to start here because this is relatively non-controversial. That even people who think the Earth is young Earth creationists actually accept a lot of evolution within these groups. So, for instance, we see this is, say, a standard house mouse, which we might, if you're unfortunate, find one in your house, or you might see it running across the road or something. But there's different strains of this species, and everyone would accept that these strains are related to each other. Sometimes we can trace out, we actually know the ancestry of some of these strains of which other strains they were bred from and how sometimes they've been genetically altered by humans or bred to have certain traits, for instance. But then there's other species which are also relatively similar, and basically everyone would accept, as far as I'm aware, that these species are related to each other. It's still very clearly a mouse. But even young Earth creationists will typically accept that rats are actually related to mice, and there's various reasons for that, largely because the genetic similarity is so high. But you can keep going further and further out. You find other things that are still very clearly basically mice. In some sense, they share a very similar body plan, which are actually in different taxonomic families. You find other rodents which are quite similar. Um, Actually, not rodents, but in different order. You find other things which sorry, not rodents, which are in a different subset of the taxonomic class, etc. So there is this kind of nested hierarchy pattern, and if we study the genetics, we see that the genetics follows the same pattern as the morphology, and the fossils also follow the same pattern. So biology is found within these nested groups. You have things which are very, very similar to each other, and then the similarity kind of decreases as you move outwards. And the genetics is consistent with the morphology at broad scale, and is also consistent with what you find kind of going backwards through time in the fossil record. So that's this basic idea of nested hierarchies, and I could give many lectures on the details of that from genetics and from the fossil record. And my expertise, of course, is in the genetics. But something else I think is interesting, if you actually look at the specific genetic differences between species, they really look like mutations. And this is something that is found at this lower link from by Logos, a Christian geneticist who's a leading human geneticist called Stephen Schaffner, has this really nice article on um, actually looking at what genetic differences look like. And so there's, if you just compare two genomes to each other and find that they're similar, what are the exact differences? It turns out that the vast majority of differences are what are called transitions. These are changes between nucleotides, which are chemically very similar to each other. So changes between A and G or between C and T. And other changes are much less common. And you see the same pattern as you go broader and broader in the phylogeny. So these are organisms which are very closely related. They've just evolved for a few years. The different strains of Wikipedia, these ones have evolved over a few million years, but the pattern is still basically the same. You still see this huge excess of transitions and the basic pattern. And you can go broader and still see the same thing. So whenever you compare genomes to each other, it's remarkable how much the differences look like the same differences that you see just from mutation, which we can study directly in the lab. Okay, there'd be lots more to say about that, but happy to follow up with your questions. What about mutations or the actual processes of evolution? What can we say about that? I think useful context is Richard Owen, who's often known as a skeptic of Darwinism. How did he respond to the origin of species when it came out? Well, his kind of a summary statement of what he said, as this quote from him, the inductive demonstration of the nature and mode of operation of such secondary, continuously operative species-producing force will henceforth be the great aim of the philosophical naturalist. So his response to Darwin is he was skeptical about natural selection, but he's saying whatever the forces are that are involved in evolutionary processes, that's what biology is going to be about from now on. So he's saying this discovery of Darwin is really important, and that it fits with this kind of great aim of biology to understand what drives the differences between species. And that's the main. So in that way, I think he fits well within evolutionary biology, and this is the project I see myself as engaged in, studying the forces and laws and processes involved in changes between species. So even someone who's skeptical of Darwinism can actually fully buy in with the broad aim of evolutionary biology. We can do this in a lot of detail now through the study of proteins. For instance, the study of viruses. So of course, SARS-CoV-2, the virus that caused the COVID pandemic, is a coronavirus. That's a family of viruses. And we can compare genomes of viruses within that family. So viruses, like organisms, are members of species, of genera, of families, etc. The coronaviruses, Coronaviridae, is a diverse family of viruses with many different proteins across the family. So this is just a map of the structure of the genome of most of the genes in the coronavirus. We can ask, okay, where do these proteins come from? And it turns out that for many of them, we can actually trace their evolution. So this is two genes within the coronavirus, OR3A, which is here, and M, which is here. And at the sequence level, they look very different, but actually at the structural level, they're very similar. And by comparing to other viruses, we can actually very clearly trace the evolutionary history of these two genes. There's just one nice example of something which everyone would basically accept are related to each other, that these coronaviruses are all part of the same family. They have common ancestry. But through that, we can actually trace a lot of change in protein evolution. And this is important because a lot of skeptics of evolution try and make arguments based on proteins that I think are not very successful, because actually we can trace vast amounts of evolutionary change through proteins. My current work, which is very much in progress, is studying directionality in protein evolution. And I'm making the claim in a paper that will hopefully come out soon that there is clear trends from between young proteins and old proteins. There's actually a directionality over many, well, over billions of years or over many millions of years. This is quite, in some ways, counterintuitive or against what has been the mainstream, but a growing amount of literature is showing that there are these very long-term trends in evolutionary history, that there is this directionality to it, and that will tie into some things I'll say soon. Okay, what do we do with that set? Is there, as Christians, is there a way to still believe in design? Can we still make design inferences or design arguments in light of the background that I've given? There's various approaches to this. My friend, who is a theologian and philosopher at the University of Helsinki, Dr. Roope Kujonen, has written a lot about this. There's approaches, including things which are not really arguments, like a design perception approach. But today I'll be focusing on the idea of a design argument. And my preference in making design arguments is to focus on the explanatory remainder after you have a mainstream evolutionary theory which is successful in the biological space. Is there something that still needs to be explained after that? And I actually think there's a lot of explanatory remainder, even after mainstream evolutionary theory, even if mainstream evolutionary theory is successful. So I think a nice way to categorize that is that the preconditions of evolution, the processes of evolution, and the products of evolution can all point to design. And I'll give quick examples of each of those. So I think there's multiple good candidates for this idea of explanatory remainder, something that still needs to be explained even if evolutionary biology is successful. So why is it that we live in a world that is hospitable to the evolution of complex life? So the preconditions of evolution are right. Why is it that that first cell, whatever that was, actually had the capacity to evolve into all the complexity that we see later? Why is it that we see some very improbable, massively transformative events within evolutionary history? Why is it that mutations have the ability to reach new phenotypes? If there are underlying laws of evolution, why are these laws so conducive to the production of new phenotypes? And if evolution is guided, or is driven by natural selection, why is it that this is able to work? Why are there these fitness landscapes that natural selection can actually climb through over evolutionary history, which is the analogy that Richard Dawkins gives of climbing Mount Improbable. Why is it that there is a kind of a smooth pathway up that kind of mountain of apparent improbability? Why is it that we can reach high complexity starting from low complexity? Each of these could be a lecture in itself, but the idea of preconditions is, I think, really important. And this is a kind of, it's not a design argument from biology. Well, it's not a design argument from evolution itself, but from the fact that evolution works. It means that we live in a world where evolution can work. And that means that world has to have certain properties. One of those that's at least hugely useful for evolution is the fact that we can have photochemistry, that we can have both vision and things like photosynthesis, that light can be used for energy and that light can also be used for vision. That requires this remarkable coincidence between the amount of energy that's found in light and the amount of energy that's required for chemistry. And it's actually an incredibly narrow band. And that corresponds both the energy that's produced by the sun or by actually most stars and the light that will actually pass through the atmosphere. So there's this kind of combination of coincidences between the light that's produced by the sun, the light that atmospheric gases will allow through, and the light that's needed for photochemistry. And that all converges on this very narrow range, which is very interesting and very useful for life and for evolution. This was developed by various people, including George Weld, who won the Nobel Prize I think, in physiology. And he was initially strongly atheistic, but towards the end of his life, he shifted towards something maybe more like deism or something like that, partly through this kind of discovery, both by studying light and its role in life and studying consciousness. He says it is mind that has composed a physical universe that breeds life. So this is, I think, a nice example of natural theology, of how it can shift people away from a strong materialism or naturalism. The process of evolution, I think, can also point to design in various ways. And there's a lot to say about this, but two categories of this. One is law-like processes like convergence in evolution, which is, of course, made famous by people like Simon Cornell Morris, a paleontologist here at Cambridge. And so that's one whole category of processes. But then there's other events or processes which are highly contingent, which look remarkably improbable, but which we still have strong evidence they did actually happen. So things like the origin of eukaryotes, which seems to have been basically a merger of bacteria and archaea to produce the first eukaryote. And there's a lot of questions about this, but a lot of the kind of standard models in this field propose a highly improbable event. And I think those improbable events are may well have happened and may be satisfactory as a biological theory of what happened, but still leave open the question of why do we live in a world where these remarkable events did actually happen, which I think is the kind of explanatory remainder that can be used in design arguments. Then the processes of evolution, the products of evolution can also point to design. Something like the famous bacterial flagellum. So I'm not making the argument that it could not have evolved, but let's say it did evolve. The fact that it did reach this remarkable molecular machine, which in some ways looks so much like an outboard motor kind of flipped over, that this is basically the propeller and this is the motor itself. Not only the bacterial flagellum, but actually fully independently of that, we have the archaeal flagellum or the archaelum, which actually is a very similar kind of structure. So that evolution keeps converging on these remarkable molecular machines, which look so much like the fully independently created human machines. I think that in itself, just these products look so much like design. I think there's room for a design argument there. Not a design argument that argues against evolution, but a design argument that looks at the remarkable phenotypes that biology did actually end up on and how they look so much like design. Okay, so that was my quick overview of some of my thoughts around evolution. I believe God has used natural processes for his purposes in many areas, including astronomy and geology and the evolution of languages, but also the origin of species. I think mainstream evolutionary theory has explanatory remainder that even if it's successful as a biological theory, which I think it still leaves some things at a deeper philosophical level unexplained, which is room for some reasonable design arguments. For more on this topic, Dr. Rebecca Yonan has looked at it in a lot of depth in this book, and I look forward to your questions.